God will surely take care of you. We need to know that promise before we start our narrative in Exodus, because the story starts on a very bad note. And we must read this story, and it should be a familiar story with many of you. If you haven't read it in the Bible or looked at it in Sunday school, surely you've seen it on television with Charlton Heston or any other television or theatrical remake of the story of the Exodus. A fascinating story. Except for the story of Jesus Christ and His crucifixion and burial and resurrection, there's no greater story of redemption for mankind than the story of Exodus. And so we're going to look at this over the next few weeks. A year ago, we wrapped up a look at the life of Joseph in Genesis. Together we have journeyed through Genesis. We have seen the very beginnings. Several years ago we went through that. And then we looked at the life of Abraham, and then Isaac and Jacob, and then Joseph. And here we are looking to see what has become with the sons of Israel, because they had lived in Canaan during a famine, but through God's orchestration of events, Joseph, one of Jacob's 12 sons, ended up in Egypt in a position of power and was able to bring his whole family down to be fed during the famine, and that's where they stayed. And the book of Exodus opens reminding, kind of recapping the story, but it's almost as if there's been no break at all. But Exodus is basically a sequel to Genesis, and it continues the story of the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It recounts the sons of Jacob and explains how Joseph had died, and so did his brothers. So all the 12 sons, the founding fathers of these tribes, they had passed away, but it tells you that there were 70 people in Jacob's household, and that was the beginning of this nation, 70 people. Now to us today it sounds like a lot of people. I'd love to have 70 people in here this morning, wouldn't you? But we know 70, when you're talking about nations, 70 is not a large number. But we see the hand of God, even though it's not explicit in this text. In verse 7 of Exodus 1, it says, "The sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them." If you recall our look at the beginnings in Genesis, when He made the animals and He made man and woman, and He said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply." So to be fruitful and to multiply was a command of God. It is God's will to be fruitful and multiply. So even though it doesn't say God caused it, we know from the context God willed it. It was His desire to see this happen. And so He was behind it all along, blessing the sons of Abraham. And for a while things were really good. If you remember the story of Joseph, Joseph had found favor in Pharaoh's eyes. Otherwise, he couldn't have gotten up to the position he was in. And when Jacob came down, as old as he was, Pharaoh was very kind to this patriarch of this Semitic people, and said, "Tell me about yourself. Tell me how old you are. What's your life been like?" And so they enjoyed the pleasantries, and they were allowed to share the land. This Pharaoh was nice, and he was peaceful, and he was kind. He was not Christian by any means. He certainly wasn't Jewish, but there was a tolerance. There was this harmony, this peace between the peoples, because even though Pharaoh in Egypt worshiped their own gods, which we know are false, they were pleasant and favorable toward the Hebrew God, Yahweh, who is the only God, creator of heaven and earth, and it's He who we worship today. Pharaoh, at that time at the least, acknowledged that God existed and sought His favor, even though he didn't just choose to worship Him alone. But sadly, something happened, and it's something that it's always been taught to me growing up. regarding the church, Christianity, they say, is one generation away from extinction. Have you ever heard that said before? Christianity is one generation away from extinction. And why would that be? What would cause something like that? Why is it feasible for Christianity to die out in just one generation? What does it take for that to happen? Any thoughts? Apathy? Okay. On whose part? On the Christians? Yeah, for sure. If this generation will not impart to the next generation what it is we believe, our doctrines, they'll die with us. They will die with us. Now, the text doesn't necessarily put the blame on Joseph's generation, but over time, the Pharaoh that was friends with Joseph, he died, and it was probably not the next Pharaoh, but somewhere down the line, another king of Egypt, another man became Pharaoh, and he didn't know the history. It wasn't taught to him. If it wasn't taught by the Hebrews, it certainly wasn't taught by the Egyptians. So he says, I don't know this Joseph. I don't know the story. All I know is these people are a nuisance to me and a threat to our nation. That's how he saw it. It says in verse 8, a new king rose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Some of you can relate to a fear like that. We hear that kind of talk these days. The talking heads on TV are always worried about the people who aren't like us. But in our context, we see the danger of that thinking. It was wrong for Pharaoh to feel that way because we know the story, right? We know who the Hebrews are. We know that they were God's chosen people. We know that God made a promise to Abraham, and we know that they meant no harm. The Hebrews had no intention of taking over Egypt because it was promised to them that there was another land that belonged to them. God was going to give it to them. So they were just there until God said it was time to go. They were happy to be peaceful neighbors. They were happy to worship their own God and not try to rock the boat, so to speak. But Pharaoh would not tolerate it. He felt threatened by it. He felt insecure. And he failed to acknowledge the power and the holiness of the God of the Hebrews. So he said in his mind in verse 10, let us deal wisely. Though he was a fool to do it, he said, let's deal wisely. And so he enslaved them. So I'm going to force them into hard labor so they're in chains, and so they have no freedom, so they cannot rise up. And he thought perhaps breaking the morale would diminish their numbers. But we see he was foiled because it says in verse 12, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied. It didn't matter how hard he worked the Hebrews, they were still able to reproduce, multiply, to become greater in numbers. Their morale wasn't crushed. Their spirit wasn't crushed. They continued to thrive in their families and continued to look to God for the hope that they had. So then the Pharaoh had another idea, one you're probably familiar with the story. He decided, if I can't work them to death where they won't be able to have any more children, I'll kill the children as they are born. So he called the head midwives in, and they're named there, and he says, I want you, when you deliver the babies, if it's a boy, kill it. If it's a girl, you can let the girls live. And you'll see how that plan backfired when he underestimated the women. Women are sorely underestimated in this story, but we see how God uses women in this story and really throughout the Bible. In the beginnings, Adam and Eve obviously gets a lot of the blame for what happened with the sin in the garden. But throughout the narrative of Scripture, you see women redeeming themselves, God using them for a special purpose. They're used specifically here in the story of Jericho. A woman figures prominently. Even in the gospel narrative, the fact that the Messiah comes through the Virgin Mary, and then at the resurrection it is women who in those days their testimony wouldn't count for anything. They were the first to see the risen Jesus. They went and gave the news to the disciples. It wasn't the male, the masculine disciples who saw Jesus first, it was the women. So God uses women, and throughout the text, throughout the Bible, you see how God uses really people who aren't respected, who don't have powerful reputations, who aren't necessarily seen as strong. God takes the weak, and He's glorified through their actions and lives. So He says to the midwives, if it's a male, kill it. If it is a girl, let it live. But listen to what happens here in verse 17. The midwives feared God. By saying that, we see right away they didn't fear Pharaoh. They should have, right? Pharaoh was the most powerful man in the world that they knew. And really, it sounds like perhaps there would have been a severe penalty for disobeying his orders. But it says they feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but they let the boys live. They directly defied the king. And so the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? And then verse 19 says, the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives can get to them. Now, a lot has been discussed about these passages here, these verses. Were the midwives telling the truth, or were they lying to Pharaoh? Was it true that the boys were being born before the midwives could even get to the home, and therefore they could not carry out the Pharaoh's direct decree? Some say yes, that's exactly what happened. They told the truth. They were innocent bystanders. They tried to do their job, but doggone it, the Hebrews are just stronger women than the Egyptians. But that would ignore what verse 17 says. The midwives feared God and did not do as the king told them. They disobeyed. They could have gotten there on time. They probably did get there on time, but they would not obey this order to kill the boys. And so this is my understanding of the Scripture. If you disagree, I'll allow that. I don't think we have to divide over this, but my understanding of what it says here is that the midwives deceived Pharaoh so they would not have to kill the boys. And then it comes to the big debate is it ever okay to lie? Is it ever okay to lie? Well, I'll put it to you this way. In my life, looking back, I cannot recall an instance where I ever was forced to lie. Now, don't misunderstand me. Mark did not just tell you that he has never lied. And I confess that, and I've dealt with that. But I've never been in a position where I had to. But let me say this. I've never been in a situation where telling the truth would have gotten somebody killed. And please forgive me if you think I'm wrong for saying this, but I've made up my mind on this. And if ever I'm in a situation, I really don't think it's likely because of the times we live in, but if I'm ever in a situation where telling the truth will get somebody killed, I'm lying, okay? I am not going to say something that's going to get an innocent person killed. I will lie to protect that person. And how do I justify that? Well, here is where I get my justification for that. There's a story in the Gospels when Jesus was in a synagogue on the Sabbath day. And there was a man there with a withered hand. And the people knew it. They knew the withered hand man was there. And they knew Jesus was there. And they knew the stories about him healing people. But it was the Sabbath day. And in their mind, healing was a work. So they were like, is he going to work on the Sabbath? Is he going to heal this man on the Sabbath? Because if he does, we got him, right? Jesus' response was, is it right to take a life or to heal? Is it right to save a life or to heal a life? Save a life or heal a life? Not is it right to work on the Sabbath or not. Is it right to save a life or to heal? Even he acknowledged that these men, these high and mighty, holy men, if their cattle, if their animal was stuck in a ditch on the Sabbath, they would put everything down and save the animal, right? They would get the animal out of the ditch. But yet they looked with disdain on this crippled man when someone there with the power to heal him was there, but they were trying to forbid it because it was the Sabbath day. So there was a principle there. If you are able to save a life, do it. It's better to save a life than to take the life. And if we would have such a high and mighty notion that I will never lie, even if it means killing somebody, I think we've really ignored a very powerful principle that Jesus has given us. But I also acknowledge that I've never been forced to put that to the test, right? There's never been we've heard the old stories about World War II in Nazi Germany. Would you have lied to the Nazis if you were housing Jews in your home, hiding them, and the Nazis came to your door and say, "Any Jews here?" Would you lie, or would you say, "Oh, they're right here, but please don't kill them"? I think we would all say, "Nope, no Jews here." But I don't know. But the midwives, I've spent a lot of time on that, but I felt it needed to be said. But the midwives deceived Pharaoh, and God blessed them for it. Verse 20, God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty because the midwives feared God. He established households for them, and then Pharaoh commanded all his people. He knew he was getting nowhere with the midwives, so he put out an order to the people saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. Now this is the setup, right? Because we heard what Joseph said to his brothers in Egypt probably centuries ago. Scholars estimate probably 200 years have passed since Joseph and this new Pharaoh. He says, God will surely take care of you. He'll bring you up from this land. That was a promise he made. But now they've been enslaved. And this wasn't just something that one day they were enslaved, the next day they were getting killed. They were probably enslaved for decades. Long enough for Pharaoh to notice the population is only getting bigger. And you don't just discern that in a matter of weeks. It's taken years, if not decades. And then he resorts to this, killing the babies. Now, how long did this go on? How long was the order to kill the children, the boys? And how many boys died? We don't know. It doesn't say. But consider the mindset of the Hebrews now. Now, the Old Testament wasn't written. Genesis wasn't written down. Exodus certainly, Exodus is happening right now in the narrative, so they didn't have that. But they had stories and they had hope. They had a promise from Joseph. God will surely take care of you. In the midst of all this, executive order to kill the newborn boys of the Hebrews, there was a Levite, and his wife, both Levites, and the woman had a child. And in chapter 2, verse 2, it says, when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. She saw he was beautiful. And I don't think that means that he was more beautiful than any other baby. But I think she recognized the beauty of a life. And I think every mother should have. And this story is concerned with Moses, but I would dare say many mothers had boys in those days, and they recognized the beauty of life. It's something we all should do. Today we're celebrating a baby on the way. And we're doing that because we know, we haven't seen the baby yet, but we already know that baby formed is in the image of God and is precious. And it could be the ugliest baby in the world, but we will love it because he is made in the image of God. No, I'm kidding. His baby's going to be beautiful, and you know that. But life is precious. In this woman, she disobeyed. The midwives disobeyed. And now this mother that we're concerned with today disobeyed because she was ordered to kill the child, but she hid it. She couldn't kill it. She knew it was not God's will to kill this baby. It's not God's will to kill any baby, born or unborn. It goes against the will of God, and we ought to be responsible in that. So much as it's in our power to do so, we should save the lives of the babies, the young. She hid him for 3 months. In fact, it says in this passage, it says that she, the mother, saw that he was beautiful. But if you notice the title in the bulletin that I put in there, "Lovely in the Sight of God," that comes from Acts chapter 7 when Stephen is given his great sermon. Right before the Jews stoned him to death, he gave the history of the people and why Jesus is the Messiah. And he told the story of Moses. And he didn't say that Mama thought he was beautiful. He said God recognized that child as beautiful. It was lovely in the sight of God. So regardless of what we think, God thinks the children are lovely. Jesus himself said, "Suffer the little children and let them come unto me." So she hid this child. She did not want to let this baby go. She knew that it was dangerous. Babies are not the quietest. Right? You can get all your Cabbage Patches and all these other these baby dolls, and maybe they make noises, but you can turn them off. There's an off switch. Babies don't have off switches, and they cry and they're loud and they make messes. And that's what's so special about them, because the experience of that, mothers and fathers know very well what that's like. But then in verse 3 it says, she could hide him no longer. She could hide him no longer. And so she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. Now, I really enjoy this translation, the New American Standard. It's really my preference, but I really think they missed the mark in here, because if you're familiar with the King James, it says that she put him in an ark. And that's really the word. It's the same word, same Hebrew word that's used in the story of Noah. So it was an intentional comparison that the baby Moses was put in an ark, just like Noah and his family were put in an ark before the flood. She put him into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Now, I don't know about you, but I really think that when she did that, she expected him to die. In fact, many point out that just the shape, the fact that it was a box, she pretty much put him in a coffin. And she set him out to be exposed. This was a common thing. They didn't necessarily do abortions, but when the child was born, if you didn't want it or couldn't take care of it, you would expose it to the elements. But you yourself didn't want to kill the child, but you would let nature take its course. And it's horrible, it's unpleasant, but it's what mothers and fathers had to do. She didn't want to let the child go. This was a gift. And she kept him as long as she could. 3 months was a very long time. He was really pushing it, but now he was just getting too old and too hard to hide. And she didn't want to face the consequences of she didn't want to see soldiers come into her home and rip that baby out of her arms. So she put him in a box and set him outside where whatever happened, she would not have to witness. I don't think that's a lack of trust. I think the fact that she hid the baby was very evident of her trust in God. But she knew now it was in God's hands. But she didn't know what was going to happen. She had no promise of God. There was no angel visited her and said this. She just said, I'm going to go and put him out there, and whatever happens, happens. But Moses had an older sister who was a little more curious than mother, and she stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. And this is where we see God beginning to keep his promise that Joseph uttered right before he died. God will surely take care of you and lead you up out of this place. It just so happened that the very place where Moses was put to be exposed to the elements, the daughter of Pharaoh went out to bathe. She saw the basket, and she sent her maid, and the maid brought it to her, and she opened it, and she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. He survived. Don't know how long he'd been out there, but he was alive, and he was crying. And even the daughter of Pharaoh, probably the most evil man in the world at that time, she had not fallen and had not been influenced for evil like he had. In fact, some even speculate she never saw him. If you know anything about harems in those days, Pharaoh probably had a number of wives and a number of daughters, and they had their own separate houses, and he probably never saw this girl. But she was the daughter of Pharaoh. But she didn't have the sense of evil that he had, the sense of hatred. She knew this was a Hebrew boy, but she knew he was precious and deserved a shot at life. And so she had pity on him. And that's when Moses' sister, Miriam, says, "Oh, it looks like you found a baby. Let me help. I'll go find one of the mothers, a nurse, someone who can nurse this child." And such the plan was set in motion. Moses' mother had more time. Typically in those days, it was 3 or 4 years. It took 3 or 4 years to wean a child. So now she had permission. And not only that, she was being paid to do it, right? Because Pharaoh's daughter says, "I'll give you your wages. You nurse this baby and I'll pay you." So Moses' mother got Moses back for 4 years, got paid to do it. God's in this, right? And so then the child grew. In verse 10, the child grew and brought him to Pharaoh's daughter to become her son. And she named him Moses and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." I drew him out of the water. Pharaoh's daughter thought she did it. I drew him out, but I tell you today, God is the one who saved him. But not just to save Moses, but he did it to save the people. Now understand this. I'm going to jump ahead. I'm going to spoil the ending for you. Moses grows up and talks to Pharaoh a lot, and finally gets permission to take the Hebrews out of Egypt, and they're free. They get freed. You know that already, right? But it says that they were there 430 years. 430 years. Now, what in your life has taken 430 years? Nothing. But how long does something happen before you cry out to God, oh, this is the worst. This is never going to end. It's never going to get better. Certainly not 430 years. Probably not 50 years. Maybe not a week. You throw up your hands. It's only been 40 minutes. This is too much. 430 years they were slaves to Pharaoh. Hey, it could take 400 years, 500, it could take 1,000 years. God's going to keep his promise. It's been 2,000 since he promised us he was coming back, and I have not given up on him. I keep telling God I'm going to stop sinning, and he hasn't given up on me, right? He hasn't given up on you. And so this is why we worship. This is a story of trust. We don't know how long God is going to let suffering continue, but we know the promise. Just as the Hebrews knew the promise that Joseph spoke, God will surely take care of you and lead you up from this land. And here we are. We're not suffering the way the Hebrews suffered in Egypt, but we have our trials and we have our afflictions and we have just the day-to-day struggle of staying faithful. But yet we know the promise that Jesus says, behold, I am coming quickly. I am coming quickly. And just like John the Revelator says, even so, come, Lord Jesus. And so I don't know what the timeline is. The Hebrews didn't know what the timeline was. In fact, you'll see that they really, it's hard for them to accept Moses as their leader. Did God really send you? Is this how we're going to get out of here? You? I feel like Moses those days, right? Me? You ever feel like that? But you know who we never have to act like that toward? God. We don't look at God and says, you're going to save us? No, absolutely. He is going to save us. He saves us through Jesus Christ, and he saves us through his promises, and he's going to surely come again. And he is going to redeem us. And so this first Sunday of the year, we are called to renew our trust, to make sure our pledge to follow him, because he's not letting us down. He hasn't let us down. He won't let us down, and he will keep his promises. The scriptures that I hope you have begun, it's the 7th day of the year. You have read your Bible 7 days in a row, amen? And you're going to keep doing it. You're going to read that Bible every day and take in God's promises and see how he's fulfilled them so you don't have to doubt. He is as real now as he was then, 1400 BC, 2000 BC. Here we are, 2018. He's real, he's alive, he's active, and he is interested in you, because you're just like that baby in the basket. You are precious. your life has value because he saw it. You are one of the reasons he died on the cross. You are his. And so trust him today and every day.